Welcome back, strategic angling fans. This is episode 30-something. I am over guessing. You got the three amigos back for the first time in a long time. We're excited to talk to you guys about a lure that all of us are passionate about, and that is the hollow body frog. I'm joined by JJ Patton and Chuck Pfizer, and we're going to tell you about the history, the when, the why, the what tackle, what colors. We're going to try to cover it all. So JJ is going to start out with a brief introduction of the frog and the history of it.
Hey guys, long ago people realized that bass like frogs. I mean, anyone that's spent any time in a lake and you kind of drift into the shallow water and you see a frog flopping around and then a bass eats it, I think people recognized that early on. Even in the early 1900s, they knew that was the case. If you look back at history, or you look at Bernie Schultz's webpage or Ken Duke's history stuff, there's a lot of old frog lures that were made. Somewhere probably around 75 or 1975, 80, they started to develop more of a weedless type of frog, or a hollow belly frog as we know it now, that was kind of primitive in use. We didn't have braided lines, so it didn't work very good. Fish would eat it, but they couldn't hook up. It was always a question of hook ratio and things like that. But it really came to the forefront around 2004, 2005 when Dean Rojas developed the Spro bronze-eye frog. And at the time he called it Kermit, and he used it in the Lake Wylie Classic that, what's the guy's name from Japan that won the Classic that year?
Takahiro Mori?
Yeah, Tak won. But Dean got a lot of press, and he was throwing the frog kind of in an unconventional frog way. He was throwing it around wood and main river type stuff in open water, and that really launched the frog craze as we know it. And that was with the original Bronze-Eye 65 from Spro. And there was frogs before that. I know Snag Proof had a Man's had a frog, and they had a rat that I used to throw as a kid.
Yeah.
But the Bronze-Eye kind of really developed that walking the dog type action with a frog that subsequently led to, in front of me there's 12 frogs that are all kind of spin-offs of that.
Yeah.
It's a good way to catch bass, especially in shallow water, but there's really no limit to it because it does have a kind of a Zara spook-like action. You can throw it in open water, you can throw it in cover, over weeds, pads. It's a fantastic bait, and as Roger always says, bass love frogs. So
yeah, actually, I think the frog, when they're feeding in the pads and in the grass, I don't think they're after frogs as much. I think they're after brim, and that's what I think most of these frogs resemble are brim. They're trying to eat bluegills.
I would agree.
Yeah, and maybe some shad, but I think primarily they're feeding on brim under those pads.
Okay, so that's a really good history, and one thing that is impressive to me about the Spro Bronze-Eye 65 is a lot of baits have evolved over the years, but I don't think there's been a whole lot of changes to the original 65. It's crazy how good they got it back then and how very little it's changed and still effective it is today. So
everybody's trying to copy it.
I think those guys in California were using them extensively before, so I think Dean had a pretty good idea of what he wanted, and he did. He nailed it spot on. I mean, it's great.
Yeah.
Still arguably in one of the top frogs, if not the top frog. I'm sure it's the top selling frog.
It's got the best hooks in it.
Yeah.
The Gamakatsu's. Comes in a lot of different sizes and by far the most colors that you can get on any frog.
Okay, so that's very good information on the history of the frog. Let's move on to maybe conditions. When are we throwing a frog?
I like sunny, no wind, pads, grass. That's when I'm throwing a frog. Once the water temp gets up, I'd say in the 60s. The people even catch them in 55, but I think when around here it seems like the frog fishing gets really hot when it gets a little hotter after the spawn. It seems like that's when more guys are doing it, even though you can catch them obviously at all times of the year. But once those pads come up, the grass comes up, the eelgrass, I think that's when people really start to think about frog fishing.
Yeah, I would agree. It starts around post spawn and runs all the way through the fall. Now,
Yeah.
I've caught them. I caught one in 48-degree water one time in Lansing on a frog that's my lowest, but certainly not the norm. But you know, what you're thrown into dictates also. You know, if you're thrown into heavy cover of any kind, brush, weeds, pads, this thing does not get snagged. I mean, you can throw it into anything, and you don't even have to be a real good caster because it can go over brush and come right through it. And that's kind of the nice thing about it, is you can get it to places where you can't get a lot of other lures to the fish and back without snagging.
Yeah, you can throw it anywhere.
Okay, so that's a little bit about the history and the when and the why. Well, you guys want to break down some of the major frog players today and why? What makes each of these uniquely good?
My favorite frog of all the frogs is, I like to throw the popping frog when I have the chance. I like the pads when they're not solid pads all the time. Little opens in them where you can throw this in the opening, pop it a little bit. I get a lot of bites on that. I go to the 65, Spro 65 bronze-eye frog when it's a lot thicker, a little more pads. And then obviously they make the King Daddy too for really heavy pads. Sometimes you can even put some weights in them to weight them down so they make a little more of an impression in the grass or in the matted vegetation. But there's all kinds of different frogs out there. Almost every company is making a frog now.
Yeah. So when you do go to the store and you consider frogs, or maybe you already love frogs, the misconception a lot of times with frogs and people so just starting out is, I just miss so many fish. So maybe tell me about the tackle, the gear that's going to make you most successful when fishing a frog.
I would say you want heavy action rod, but you want a little bit of a tip on it, especially if you're tending to be in open water. You need to work the frog a little bit, and there's a lot of videos out there on how to walk the dog with a frog. But really the key is you want a little bit of slack in your line so that you're working your line, not your frog. I use a 736 Dobbins most of the time that I'm frog fishing. Chuck will probably talk about, there's a longer rod gives you some advantage with casting distance, especially if you're on a big shallow flat and you can't get your trolling motor to the fish, or you don't want to spook the fish and you want a little more casting distance. A longer rod sometimes will help with that. Also helps a little bit when you're yanking them out of there, because sometimes you're pulling them out of pads and grass, and you really need to get them up and get them coming at the boat. So for sure a heavy action rod, but you don't really want a broomstick because you want to be able to work it. And then I prefer a fairly fast gear ratio reel for two reasons. Number one, when you get one and you get them up top, you need to get them moving towards the boat and in the boat. And number two, if you see one thing when you're frog fishing is that you want to be very observant of your surroundings and watch for swirls in the water or blow-ups in the water. Because a lot of times you're in shallow water and you'll see a fish will give away its location, and then you want to reel in real quick and then zoom cast over there and you'll catch it. And that's one thing, if you are frog fishing, I would advise is that you're very, very observant with sight and sound. Don't be playing iTunes in your earbuds and not listening, because you need to listen, watch, and
yeah, a lot of times you can hear the brim sucking in the water, and then you can also, a lot of dragonflies are out, blackbirds. I mean, bass will eat blackbirds.
Oh yeah.
I mean, so you do really have to pay attention to anything in the water, anything that moves in the water, because a lot of times it could be a bass and he might be ready to eat.
Okay, and then the rule of thumb with fishing a frog, I know you've talked about walking it, long casts, be quiet, be observant.
On that, walking the frog, before you get in that.
Yeah.
A lot of times too, to help you walk the frog, sometimes some people will shorten one of the legs to make it a little offset. That does help you.
And the popping frog, if you want to learn how to walk the dog with a frog, the popping frog walks better than the regular one.
Yeah, it walks really easy.
It's really easy to learn how to get it to do that.
Back and forth, yeah.
I was just going to ask, a common misconception people have is if I get a blow up, I need to set hook immediately. There's kind of two trains of thought on it. Some people will swear by instant hook sets. I haven't had as much success with that. What, do you guys give the fish a little bit of time to quote unquote get it in its mouth, or is it a pretty instant?
I don't. When I see the fish hit the bait, I think by the time we react and set the hook, the fish has already done what it's going to do.
So you're not a buyer in 2 count?
Well, I normally don't, because I figure, that he's got the bait. Once I see him hit it, by the time I set the hook, I think it's perfect timing.
I'm a little different. I prefer to see the frog disappear. But every day is different, just like with every you fish a jig, sometimes you set it right away, sometimes they're nibbling on the tail and coming up. But same thing with a frog, sometimes they'll knock it out of the water and it'll land, and then they'll injure it and come get it. And so a lot of times I'll wait a little bit. You don't want to wait too long, but if they want to eat that thing, they're going to eat it. And I don't think waiting hurts. I think setting too early hurts more than waiting too long.
Yeah, I mean, I wait for him to eat the frog.
Yeah.
I make sure the frog's gone, but I don't. After he eats that frog, I don't wait.
No, when it's gone.
When it's gone, I set the hook right away.
And that's a benefit of using some of these frogs. You'll see they have a yellow back, or they're brighter on the top, and you can see it. And if it's not there, then you need to set the hook because it's in the mouth. It doesn't just disappear.
Yeah. So you brought up color. That's a perfect segue to my next question. Pro has 30 something colors of frogs. You can spend a lot of time trying a lot of different colors.
Yeah.
What do you guys do with colors? Do you keep it pretty simple? You using a lot of different colors? Talk to me about how you choose what color frog.
Basically, I use 3 different colors, and anybody can get away with 3 different colors. You can probably get away with 1, just throw black. But primarily, I throw a black frog, a white frog, and some type of bluegill imitation, like killer gill.
Yeah.
Those are basically, if you just were going to buy 3 frogs, those would be the 3 frogs that I would purchase.
And I would echo that. I would say black, white, and a bluegill or color. But I would also probably add in there one that's a little bit louder, that may imitate like a perch. It may, I mean that's real loud. That one probably worked for smallmouth if you catch them. And I know that MLF thing last week, they did catch some smallmouth on frogs. But something with a little bit of yellow or orange or green that may look like a yellow perch. I think a lot of yellow perch live in shallow grassy areas, and we talked about earlier, they're not always eating a frog. And sometimes if something looks like a perch, acts like a perch, then that bass thinks it is a perch and it'll eat it. Perch are very tasty morsels. They're high protein and no fins.
High protein, okay. So we've talked history, we've talked the different frogs in the market a little bit, we've talked about when we're using frogs, we've talked about the gear, we've talked about color. Anything else you two want to add about the general specifics?
Well, just on the frog or on the rods itself, like JJ, I use a 736 heavy a big majority of the time, but I will use an 8-foot heavy also when it's you do want to make the long cast.
Yep. Or
you're in some really heavy trash where you really got to have a lot of power. Also, I use I'm not sure what JJ used, but I use 65-pound braid. I have used 80, but I generally don't go below 65.
Yeah, don't try to reinvent the wheel, guys. Do not use mono. Do not use fluoro. I actually talked to a buddy of mine tonight that's fishing the Bass Regional up in La Crosse, and he's a boater from Ohio, and his co-angler today was using some mono, and he said he lost about 12 to 15 fish today, so he knows exactly where 12 to 15 fish are to go back to tomorrow. And he's pretty excited about it, but don't reinvent the wheel. Use braid and at least 50 pound. If you don't have that and you want to use 30, okay, but then make sure you're checking for abrasion, because sometimes you're pulling this stuff over weeds, rocks, logs, and that braid will fray a little bit, and all of a sudden your 65-pound braid is 20 pound, and when you're horsing them in, it breaks because there's no stretch. There's not a lot of room for give if there's a weak point in that line.
Yeah.
Okay, and this was just on the traditional frog. We've got another
Yeah.
episode planned for frogs that are more your moving style with the paddlings on the back or the horny toads. And we may even have another video on how we modify these frogs. But we wanted to start out by giving you guys just a general overview of frogging. So
Yeah, and Matt sells all these
Yep.
different frogs.
yeah,
at
I
his
would,
store.
I would add one thing, just a little bit. We talked about 3 different sizes. So you got popping frogs. You got the 50, the 60, the 70, and I don't know how well you guys can see the difference in size,
Oh,
but there's a fairly significant difference in size. And I would base this on 2 things. Number 1, how far are you casting? Number 2, how big is the bait? If they're chasing little river minnows, and sometimes this little guy will be just the ticket because it looks like one of those little river minnows or baby shads. Probably the 60 or the original poppin' frog in this case would be the one you throw most of the time. But if you want to throw a little further, have a little more bulk, or if they're chasing big gizzard shad, then maybe you go to the big one.
Right.
Base, and you don't, if you want a rule of thumb, you get the 65 bronzeye and the 60 popper, and those are pretty good all around. You don't need to buy hundreds of frogs. You buy these 2, they work most of the time, and
Right.
you're getting a little ticky-tack when you change
Yeah.
sizes.
Yeah, and you can get away with a 7-foot heavy.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to go out and buy a long rod for just one application.
No.
If you only have a 7-foot medium heavy, 7-foot heavy, buy a couple frogs, try it. Put some braid on there, and you'll have a lot of fun, especially pond fishing or anywhere there's slop. There's usually fish close by.
You brought up a good point. We had that pond, shore fishing episode. A frog, and Frank mentioned a frog is a great bait to throw offshore because you can throw it into 20 feet of water and bring it into a foot of water, and it's still going to be on top. It's not going to be digging into the bottom or into the shoreline grass that may exist. So that it's a great bait, to use offshore. Pretty much from early spring all the way till the ice comes.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else that you want to add about frogs before we sign off?
No, I'm good.
Okay, very good. Well, we'll see you guys next Tuesday for another episode of Strategic Angling presented by K&K True Value in Bettendorf, Iowa. We appreciate you tuning in. We appreciate you subscribing. We appreciate you sharing with your friends. And we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.